Yeah, thanks, Matt, and to the board. It's always a pleasure to visit with you. And as Steve indicated, we're actually at a very critical moment with regard to May 11th, the lifting of Title 42 pandemic restrictions that have been used by both the Trump administration and the Biden administration to maintain some semblance of control over the border. But what I'd like to do is first kind of step back, maybe uh, uh, more than several yards, and put what I think will turn out to be the most challenging a, a day and period of time at the U.S. border in American history because of the what we already see happening. So, for example, even before the lifting of Title 42, the Border Patrol has 23,000 migrants in its custody, and it has only capacity across the U.S. border from San Diego to Brownsville of 14,000 places. So it already, even before the Title 42 is lifted, you see this surge that threatens to overwhelm the Border Patrol and the CBP DHS effort to control it. But let me step back and put this in context, because what we're seeing and what we will see over the next week to 2 weeks or 3 weeks is the result of us having constructed over the last generation a method of border security and border control that is completely unsuited to deal with the conditions being faced today. So from 1993, when Gatekeeper, 94, when Gatekeeper began here in San Diego, Operation Hold the Line in El Paso, successive administrations from both parties, Clinton to George W. Bush to Obama to President Trump, invested $18 billion a year in border security. And there was a system of barriers and fences, sensors, and a tripling of agents in terms of manpower and woman power resources. All of that created what was, at least at the end of the Obama administration, a border that was had seen the fewest number of migrants entering irregularly or illegally that we had seen in 4 decades. And then after an initial problem when the numbers went up in the Trump administration, the border then came under control and was really shut down in terms of illegal migration because of the pandemic in beginning in March of 2020. But the larger issue, and what we're seeing here today, and we will see dramatically in evidence over the next period, is that this method of control, this idea of controlling the borderline and securing the borderline, worked when we were dealing with decades of Mexican migration, in which Mexican migrants who entered illegally could be returned in fairly expedited fashion across the border. And then even when Central Americans in 2014, 2015 started coming in large numbers, working with Mexico, we could see repatriation and return from the borderline. What we have today, though, is a combination of two things that shows that we're fighting the last war and we're destined not to win it because the system of border security that we have in place is not suited to a situation in which the asylum laws are completely broken and non-functioning, so that people who come to the border today, as we speak, are not seeking to avoid Border Patrol agents, but rather they are seeking to find them so that they can initiate the asylum process. And then the second major factor that's changed, that makes our current system ill-equipped to meet the challenge, is we're dealing with people from all over the globe. The global migrant mobility is bringing with us people from all over, not just from the northern tier of Central America and Mexico, but now large numbers of Venezuelans, Colombians from South America, Cubans and Haitians from the Caribbean, which has been a standard and staple feature of our system. But we're also seeing Turks, Afghans, Nepalese in numbers that we hadn't seen before. And when the Border Patrol apprehends these folks, or when they come into the custody of DHS, they can't be returned to the country of origin, because in many cases, as particularly with China, but not only China, the sending country will not take people back. So as a result of that, we come into the lifting of Title 42 with a situation that will, I think, have two main lessons. One is that the administration actually has designed, as a theoretical matter, we can go into this, what I mean by a theoretical matter, they have designed a policy that actually makes sense, that was based on an approach to Ukrainians earlier last year, and then to Venezuelans this year, where we actually provided legal pathways so that people could apply for entry into the United States, did not need to come to the border. In fact, were discouraged from doing so. That system was announced by Secretary Mayorkas as now being generally applicable. We also worked to create regional ties, which is necessary. No one nation can control its border and the migration challenges being faced without cooperation from its neighbors in a regional sense. And that's part of the policy. The third thing is that there is a real effort to understand how important Mexico is. I can tell you from my experience, when we first ran into the unaccompanied minor issue in 2014, that were it not for Mexico, we could not have controlled either the movement of unaccompanied children or the surge of Central Americans that began without the support of Mexico. So all of these matters are leading to what I think is going to be a challenge, because while theoretically this policy makes sense, the administration has not built the capacity to even begin to implement it. So, for example, it announced that there would be an offshoring of applications, that there would be overseas centers created and opened in Guatemala and Colombia for people to apply. Those are not, have not been created. We do not have the capacity to move from the relatively straightforward expulsion of people under Title 42 to Title 8, which is the use of expedited removal, which is what the administration says that it intends to do. But expedited removal takes 24 to 48 hours to accomplish. When you have 23,000 people already in custody, the opportunity to process people is simply not going to be possible given the crush. It's estimated that there are between 100,000 and 150,000 people already proximate to the U.S. Southwest border with Mexico, waiting to come forward. What we see in this, by the lack of capacity, is paralleled by the lack of communication clearly of what the government's policy is going to be. So while the leadership at DHS and the State Department announced that if you come to the borderline, you will be turned back. In fact, that was never going to be the case for about a third of the people arriving at the borderline. That is families who arrive, and unaccompanied children are paroled or are permitted to make their asylum claims and are moved into the United States. Title 42 was used for the 2/3 of single males that were being turned away, but now we're confronted with a situation where these numbers have come, and obviously the smugglers continue to control the messaging because they have told tens of thousands of people that if you get to the U.S. border, you are much more likely than not going to be admitted into the United States to wait for an immigration court hearing that is scheduled 3 or 4 years downstream and often never comes to pass. So all of this adds up, I think, ladies and gentlemen, to a problem that is going to materially impact our political situation in this country, but also it reveals that as much as the administration has struggled to articulate policies that work, it has not received the support of the Congress to resource those policies to create the capacity to actually get it implemented, so that when you get large numbers of people, you face what we're going to face without the ability to do anything but for those that cannot be returned across the border to Mexico or through Mexico to Central America, you're going to see people being metered quickly into the United States. While we are a nation of immigrants, we are also a nation of the rule of law, and the rule of law will suffer greatly as a result of this lack of capacity, which is the function of insufficient resources, but also the parlous state of our immigration laws, which are completely broken, need repair. Everyone agrees, although they can't agree on how to fix it. But it is, I will say, of great surprise to me that neither the Trump administration nor the Biden administration, when they controlled the government, that is, both houses of Congress and the White House, why neither administration chose to reform the asylum law. The political answer is that they could not get the 60% required to overcome the filibuster in the Senate. But the question then is, why couldn't you do it when, in fact, the ruptured state of our asylum law and system creates the spectacle that we're about to witness, and we've witnessed in the past, frankly, over the last 2 administrations. Why don't I stop there, Matt, if that makes sense, and we can engage in a fuller dialogue.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And just some of these numbers, I was kind of gearing up for this discussion, looking forward to it. And I saw NBC reported an even starker example. They say there are 27,000 people already in custody. So I don't know if that's a fluid number or the most recent number.
Well, it's a fluid number. But yeah, but we have to keep in mind that, remember, the total capacity of CBP holding facilities,
yeah,
across the border is 13 or 14,000. So we're already double, and tomorrow hasn't even arrived.
No, NBC reported that. They said 18,500, but the point stands that there are way more people already in custody than there's capacity for. And the last 2 days have seen 10,000 plus people pour in, and that's a record yesterday at 11,000. So we're walking into something. And so, but I guess I set that up. And the other number that jumped out at me, just contextually, I think is important for this conversation, is that more than 2.5 million people were turned away during Title 42 because of using Title 42. So just quick math shows you that that's a ton of people a year, a month, and a day that are being turned away. So we're definitely walking into something here. My question is, we've known that Title 42 was going to be lifted. Biden said during his campaign he would lift it, and then he did a bunch of verbal gyrations to say that it was going to be lifted or it wasn't, and his lawyers fought it in court. But they knew at some point it would be lifted. Why then are we reaching this point tomorrow and Thursday and the days to come where we're not set up better for it? Like you last time, and I do appreciate you regularly checking in with us. Last time we talked a lot about how this isn't just a United States problem. There are other countries, not just Mexico, Guatemala, and others in Latin America that need to be a part of this solution. And as you said, there's 100 processing centers coming where people are going to be required to check in order to take advantage of the U.S. migrant system, the asylum system, assuming that holds up in a court of law. So my question is, why didn't the Biden administration knowing that this day was going to happen, get people in those places, have a day set up where we were better equipped to do this? Because it seems like plans are only as useful as the money behind them and the staff to implement them, and we have neither of those things.
I think that's a fair question, and the president himself has said that we should expect, in his words, chaos over the next period, several weeks at the border. That is a question that for which I think the administration is accountable. Why was there no capacity? And while there is truth in the administration pointing out that Congress did not cooperate, either in fixing the asylum law or in generating the resources, the question is why is that not? Why hasn't that been made more clear to the American people over the last 6 months? And in fact, the administration is, even today, I believe the Secretary of Homeland Security is having a press conference talking about new policies that will be put into place that, as I said, theoretically address the issue. These things could work over time if properly implemented. But the question is why so late? And why hasn't a more effective campaign been waged to generate the resources from Congress that you would need to make this happen? This is one of the vulnerabilities that we face. The other one, frankly, is that, in addition to just the lack of capacity, is that Mexico is under enormous pressure, and the politics with Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador as president is fraught in any event. But the fire that killed 40 people in Chihuahua and Juarez a month ago is really compromising the ability within the context of Mexican politics for Mexico to cooperate. And while it's agreed to take 30,000 people a month in terms of Nicaraguans, Cubans, and Haitians, I think it's doubtful that they're going to be able to do that, either because they lack the desire or the capacity to do it. Same thing with regard to, okay, when people start being released into the United States, while again, the administration has shown foresight by getting $290 million into local communities to help local communities deal with the overrunning of public service that happens. That will be not even the beginning if in fact these numbers continue. If we continue at 70, take the number you have, which is consistent with the number I last heard, which is that 11,000 people entered even before Title 42 was lifted. Let's assume that we stay at 12,000 people a day. That's 84,000 people a week. Let's assume that goes on for 6 months. If it goes on for a year, then in fact you have almost 2.5 million people, 3.5 million people coming into the, 3.54 million people coming in. Even if it's only the number of people that have come in over the last 2 years, which is 3.5 million, if they come in over the course of a year, this is going to overwhelm border communities, let alone what it will do to the Border Patrol. So this is an issue that is fraught with the consequence and implications for what we have to do to actually implement, as I say, the sensible policies the administration has articulated, but not generated the resources to implement.
Well, and the great frustration about not just doing it while you had control of Congress, while the Democrats had control of Congress, is that now we're doing this in an election year. So there's no way there's going to be a solution coming, right? Like there's no reason or expectation to settle this by either party.
That would appear to be right.
Or am I wrong? I'm
No,
pretty confused about this
appear
thing.
to be right. We are paralyzed on issues of migration and border. Uh, and we haven't started the debate that we need to have that says, look, we don't have a border security issue at the borderline. This is an issue of migration management. It's about controlling the border in a satisfactory way. And the biggest obstacle to that is that we don't have the tools to manage migration. It's not the post 9/11. I mean, in fact, thanks to the dedicated efforts of many public servants at all levels of government, we won the war on terror. We have to keep our eye on counterterrorism as a goal. But in fact, the issue at the border is not counterterrorism anymore. That mission has been superseded by migration management as the chief mission for U.S. Customs and Border Protection.
Let me ask you one last question and then just kick the mic to my colleagues. But you touched on a subject that I wanted to ask you, but I saw a quote from DHS, because if we're talking 10, 11, 12,000 people a day coming in, the question becomes, is it a border security issue or is it not? Republicans will say that it is because you don't know those 10,000 people. But DHS says that those 10, 11, 12,000 people who are being deposited in the country with no way to track them ahead of some sort of hearing that may, as you said, may or may not happen, that they're folks who have, quote, undergone strict national security and public safety vetting. So what vetting does take place, and what is the response when people say, well, what about the national security threat?
So this is an issue, but there is the capacity because of the systems that have been put in place in the post 9/11 era, the last 20 years, that permit you to check people against databases, both biometrically and also in terms of text and names. The challenge is going to be, again, just the numbers. When you get people and there's no place to hold them, you are going to see the letting people into the country without the kind of thorough security check that you would prefer and that ordinarily takes place. Now, it's always an issue of finding needles in haystacks, and there is care. I mean, the Border Patrol, the men and women of Border Patrol, and Homeland Security investigations, and ERO at ICE. These are professionals, so that there are areas in the world where people will be checked. So when Afghans show up, or Turks, or people from the Arab Gulf, I'm sure they're not the procedures for them to be specifically checked and vetted through a variety of systems that are there. But it is a risk. There's no question about it, that when you're overwhelmed by numbers, that security suffers in the process. But I don't see that, Matt, as the primary and the principal risk here. The principal risk is either we see an inability to control these flows that then encourages the smugglers to actually accelerate them as the smugglers themselves continue to build their infrastructure. There are videos that are circulating showing in the Darien, the gap between Colombia, the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama, there was never an area of passage. In fact, 10 years ago, 13 years ago, when I was commissioner, we started to see a slight uptick in the number of people coming, being smuggled, would come to Brazil from the Eastern Hemisphere and then be smuggled through the Darien Gap. The number there was under 1,000, and we dealt decisively to get the government of Panama to cooperate in shutting that down. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, indeed thousands of Venezuelans now streaming through the Darien Gap. We can't let them get through Central America to Mexico, because once they get into Mexico, if Mexico is unable or unwilling to contain them, these are the people that get that then are, for want of any other alternative, permitted into the United States.
Your theory about borders being less about sovereignty now than about controlling flows turns up everywhere in coverage around the world. I saw it in coverage of Britain's bizarre deal with Rwanda. And I think the thing about Darien Gap, it's up to 250,000 people last year, I read. So it's always presented as such a daunting obstacle. But if 250,000 people are getting through, it doesn't sound that daunting. But one of the most interesting parts about this is rich nations trying to externalize immigration control to poor nations. It's being called a modern form of imperialism, in which rich countries bully smaller countries like Trump did with Mexico and other nations to do its bidding. But is that really a fair criticism, or is this just a kind of a management of reality and the fact that rich nations are such an appealing place to go for people who are nations that have been mired in poverty for generations and don't seem to be having much prospect for getting out of it? How cynical is this process of externalizing our border protections?
Well, it's not cynical at all. It describes what's happening, both in terms of the flow, the push out of countries that are unable to care for its people, and the pull into the United States and Europe, North America and Europe, because of the opportunities that exist. And the geography then leads to border control efforts moving away from the borderline as nations try to enlist time and space to be able to control the flow far away from the borderline. What's remarkable is that and you could describe that as an imperialism, except for the fact that the destination countries, the developed countries that are trying to control these flows, they have not yet equipped the other countries, the countries that must actually take action if this is to be successfully dealt with. They haven't provided the help. So, for example, if we want Mexico to take 30,000 people a month and hold them until they can be orderly, admitted in an orderly fashion for processing in the U.S. immigration system, you would think that there would be some requirement to build the kind of proper shelters that would avoid the fires that killed 40 people in Chihuahua. Or if you wanted Panama to control the Darien Gap, you would provide the resources or assist in providing the resources to accomplish that. What's remarkable is that this is being outsourced, as it has to be as a matter of geography, but it's got to remain a partnership. You can't just say you take care of it, because the consequence of that, frankly, is that it won't be taken care of. And that's the threat we see both in the current situation with Mexico not being able to provide the critical backstop that it has ever since the Obama administration, and the cooperation we saw during even going back to the Clinton administration here in San Diego, Tijuana. So you're right. I just don't see it as it's not cynical. It's a historic necessity given where the flows are now. But why doesn't the partnership extend to providing real assistance and making this kind of thing happen?
Which gets to my next and last question. I'll open it up to everybody else afterwards. The Biden administration, to me, is just doing a bizarre job here. It's exposed itself to criticism both from the left and the right on immigration, by things like trying to outsource immigration control, but then not providing resources, by things like rallying or inveighing against Trump while doing Trumpy kind of things for nearly 2 years. What would your advice be to the Biden administration? Because it doesn't seem to have a coherent whole to it now in terms of explaining its policies to either the left or the right in a way that draws support.
Well, in the short term, it seems to me you've got to stop the hemorrhage that we will see over the next period in the short term, and that you would just have to do by having a blanket return of people, but you'd have to assist Mexico or Central America in handling this in order to just stop and maintain control. Midterm, I think the Biden administration needs to double down on this effort to force a reform in the structure, in the immigration laws, as well as to generate the resources to implement what I think is a series of sound measures that they've proposed but cannot implement. And then just in terms of reacting to how did this happen, and recognizing that both parties have contributed to the impasse that we have in immigration law over the last 15 years, ever since the failure of the Gang of Eight immigration reform, is that, yes, the Biden administration reacted during the campaign and then the first 2 years of its existence to doing anything but Trump. Now it finds itself implementing as the president realizes that these flows are not sustainable as a matter of politics, if not security. We start to see many of these measures to be implemented in a more orderly way than had been the case during the Trump administration. But we can't have an immigration policy that swings as widely pendulum-like. We've got to reinvent and locate the center, which always was the basis for sound immigration and border control in the past. There was a consensus among Republicans and Democrats. Both the left and the right fringes, they didn't like the policy, but there was a centrist approach that had a strong consensus. We haven't had that since the Gang of Eight deal fell apart, wasn't voted on because of the Hastert rule in the House. And there's no way we're going to be able to resolve this in the mid or long term without relocating our politics on immigration to the center.
A number of U.S. cities have already declared states of emergencies of their own. And you previously mentioned the word overwhelmed. And it just makes me wonder if we as a nation come, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, are so overwhelmed, is there some sort of way for us to declare a state of emergency and suddenly all bets are off the table? And if we did such a thing, what would that look like? What form would that take?
Yeah, I think there is a national security capacity for the president to do that. And I think, as we see here in San Diego, there is a threat that large numbers of migrants, not likely to happen here in San Diego, but it could, but certainly in El Paso or Brownsville could rush through the the ports of entry in the way that we saw in the early 90s when people would rush through the ports of entry. And then we put a stop to that. So you have that immediate security issue, but just this constant flow, I think you could get an emergency declaration that would stop entry. I don't think we're going to get to that point, but we could. And I think it would be could be implemented by law enforcement, supplemented by National Guard, and as we saw, even active duty troops, not directly involved in migration management, but there for security reasons. If we don't stop if we don't get in the way of the smugglers controlling the messaging, we may be faced by that situation. But the only way that you get the word out is instead of people calling on their cell phones, migrants, every one of which is a sympathetic case given the circumstances they're fleeing. But as long as those migrants are on a cell phone calling back to their communities and their families saying, we got in, this flow will not stop.
So you don't think there's any danger of that emergency taking the form of what a lot of people claim is we're just going to throw the borders open?
No, I think I think the administration is not going to do that. They're going to be compelled to release people into the country simply because there's no other option of holding them or returning them to the sending country. talking about other than Mexicans and Central Americans. But I don't think we're yet at the point where we're going to see a total shutdown. I'm just saying that's a risk if we don't provide better answers than we have to date. That could be a problem. As I said, for the president himself to admit that we're going to see chaos over the next period presents a daunting possibility.
Alan, there actually were some tactical exercises by CBP the other day. They had shields and batons, and they were doing some kind of practice, which was a little bit frightening to see. But I think it's realistic what you're saying. What I don't hear anymore is guest worker programs. And I think if you speak to a lot of the people that are waiting on the other side, I mean, getting here is one thing, but providing for your families is another. And I don't hear stories about people saying, I just want to get to the United States and stay there forever and ever, because they're leaving a lot of family members behind. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. You know, the Bracero program in the 50s seemed to do some calming of a rush of people coming. They came, they left. What do you think? Is that a big missing piece of this puzzle now?
So, in fact, the administration has been actually quite effective in proposing legal pathways for people. The difficulty is they haven't countered the smuggler message that basically says, well, if you listen to the government policy, you'll wait months before you could take advantage of any of this, and I will get you admitted into the country in a matter of weeks. That's the tension that's going on. So again, it's the administration has got the policy elements right. It just doesn't have the infrastructure to implement it effectively. But there's also another point that you've raised, Laura, that's worth exploring, which is that, remember, when we're dealing with, because of the history of migration, irregular migration and legal migration in this country, when a person comes from Central America, from the northern tier, or from Mexico, there's usually a support network in place in the United States to be able to absorb these people. When you're dealing with Venezuelans, for example, or you're dealing, who do not have the support network as a result of migration over previous generations, that's where it falls on the cities. That's where it falls on the NGOs that are trying to fill a gap that is very difficult to fill. There is no support network for many of the people that are coming into the country in irregular fashion, which strains local communities in a dramatic way. And San Diego, while there's been a whole effort on the part of the NGO community to really provide lots of support, San Diego has not had the numbers that the Rio Grande Valley has had, or that El Paso has had. I don't think San Diego is going to be overwhelmed. And while I understand why the Border Patrol is doing the tactical exercises to send, and is actually going to do a warning, I understand that when Title 42 is lifted tonight or tomorrow night. I guess it's tonight. It's 9 o'clock here because it'll be midnight in Washington. When that lifts, it's important to say that the rule of law will be upheld. I'm concerned that we don't have the resources to do that in a credible way, and it is not helpful for government officials to make statements that are disproven by the facts on the ground almost as soon as the statements are made. That is, I think, where unfortunately we are to some extent. But legal pathways, the administration has been good, but not quickly enough, again, as a matter of infrastructure and resource.
You mentioned the Hastert rule preventing any action on the Gang of Eight, but it seems to me like, if anything, the House Republicans are even like by a factor of 3 or 4 more radical than they were under Denny Hastert. It really seems like we're in a period of like a great stagnation on major policy changes because we've got a divided country. Do you have, as a larger question, how much does that overhang all of this? That we're stuck in this mess because we've got a permanent kind of standoff on many big issues.
No question that is going to prove a debilitating factor in terms of continued leadership in the world. There has been the ability, as we saw in the Infrastructure Act, for the parties and leadership from both sides of the aisle to pull together to accomplish major legislative goals. On migration, that has not been the case for reasons that are tribal in nature, and the exploitation of border and migration management to stoke people's fears of the unknown and of the other continues to be have great appeal to certain politicians. When the Obama administration left office, the border, as I said, had seen the fewest number of apprehensions, under 350,000 people, than it had seen in 4 decades. And yet the 2016 campaign went off on the lack of border security and the flows of migrants. So this is a particular issue that seems intractable, particularly given the impasse politically we have. I'm hopeful that we will continue to make progress in other areas, and that eventually we will see that the broken immigration system is something we have to fix, and that maybe an experience of the kind we're about to have will lead people in both parties to recognize that their more radical colleagues on left and right are really driving us into a ditch as a nation, and that if they don't rise to the occasion and show some leadership, it will be very difficult for us to get ourselves out of the ditch, certainly on migration matters, and increasingly with regard to other issues that we now seem to be able to still resolve in a bipartisan fashion. But this one is difficult, and it's just not, blaming the Biden administration for this. I understand why that's going to be politically tempting to Republicans, but the fact is both parties are accountable for this impasse. And it's not something that started even 2 years ago. It started many years ago, and when neither Trump nor Biden have sought to fix the asylum system, which is the immediate root problem, that the blame for that has to be put at both at the foot of both parties. But this is the tragedy, is that doesn't seem to get people to rise to the American need the way it might have in past years. But I've never felt pessimism to be a useful tool, so I'm optimistic that we will emerge from this dangerous period in our politics and history, as we have from others.
Ellen, I'm wondering if you've been to any of the shelters. My colleague Tanya Navarro and I both went to different shelters in Tijuana to interview people. And I actually went when a lot of the Russians and Ukrainians were coming in after the war started. And the shelters that I saw were just night and day. There was a very organized situation for a lot of the Ukrainians. They came in, a lot of churches got involved from the United States and went over to help. And it was just clean and very organized versus some of the other shelters that I saw. And of course, in San Diego, we had the San Diego Rapid Response Network, where a bunch of organizations got together, mainly Jewish Family Services, and just organized and are still helping the people that come over to get them off to where they're going if they have a sponsor. But the whole system, and then seeing people wedged between the fence with no shelter using garbage bags for blankets and having nowhere to use the facilities, et cetera, et cetera. It's just been mind blowing to see. I just wondered if you've gone yourself.
Yeah, I have seen, I haven't gone on this trip, but I have seen the shelters that, again, this is the point. How can we expect Mexico to actually deal with this when we don't actually provide the help and create the infrastructure that would permit them to do it? Now, recognize this is also the difficulty in Mexican politics, is there's often not a willingness to accept that help, but it hasn't been either asked for sufficiently or provided adequately. And it leaves a huge tragedy in store for arriving migrants.
I brought the theory up about the radicalism of House Republicans to friends in policy discussions overall, and some of them push back and say, the real issue here is the gap between how Americans feel about immigration and how their elected leaders feel about immigration. You can look at polls that show that a majority of Americans believe there should be less than 500,000 people admitted in the country a year, way less than the average of 1 million or slightly more than 1 million that we've seen forever. And there's polls that show that some people believe there should be no net immigration. So is this truly a Republican problem, or a Republican extremism problem, or is it a fact that, as always, there's been more support for immigration among the people in power than among rank and file Americans?
Yeah, I think the MAGA era, of that dominates Republican primary politics, certainly at this point, that this is a particular issue that's doing damage. But there's no question that there is a definite sense among people all over the country, across both aisles, that you cannot have a system in which the rule of law does not operate. And that the lack of order and orderly process, which the administration, again, theoretically has come up with a system to deal with, that until we implement that system, you're going to find people from both the parties, particularly in the center, not being happy with what's going on at the border. But this is a constant attention in American politics. We all are, except for Native Americans, are the results of immigration. And the immigration of people in our families in previous years, and yet the tendency of new immigrants to want to pull up the ladder behind them, and as people get older, to develop fear of the unknown. That's a tension that's built into American history, but we've typically been able to resolve it. So I think you'll see the poll numbers fluctuate. The tension is a staple of American history, but we've managed it in the past, and I believe we can manage it again. But there are going to have to be a reassertion of the center, and people are going to have to come forward from both Republican and Democratic side, and actually show a profile and courage by saying, if we don't reform this immigration law, we will not be able to manage migration or control the border in the way that the people demand.
I can only imagine how much worse this week would be if Tucker Carlson was on television on Fox News. And I'm not being facetious. It would be terrible. But so my question to you is, how do you think his absence will factor into this, and how much of narrative framing by traditional media outlets or cable television anchors will color people's perceptions of this and lead to either an impasse or potential solutions?
But I think people know. I think Matt, you're going to see that. Tucker Carlson wasn't the only one who was exploiting this issue. But the same thing can be said about on the left. Many people from the advocacy community that no longer control the administration's immigration policy, they're attacking the administration for the theoretical changes that they would have made. They're saying this is going back to Trump to Trump approaches to migration. So you have the issue not only on the right, you have the issue on the left, which again gives me some hope that eventually leadership will emerge that says we have to ignore both of those voices, that they're destructive, they're not accurate, and they're certainly not balanced. And we have to reform the asylum law as the first step in getting out of the mess that we're currently in, which, from my way of seeing, both extremes have landed us in over the last 5 to 8 years.
How do we do that when, you know, to your point about right and left, Newsom's taking his fight to other states rather than staying here and fixing California's problems, which is a whole other conversation. DeSantis is putting immigrants on airplanes and flying them to Martha's Vineyard. Like, it seems like people aren't sitting down, and those aren't people who are in power now, right? In terms of a federal level. So how do we get people to have those? It seems like, and this is, I know you're an optimist at heart. I have optimistic tendencies, but I'm pessimistic about certain things. In an election year, I just don't see how I think it's going to get worse, not better.
Yeah, but ultimately it will be the election that resolves it. So I'm not, you know, I really believe that and have faith that when people vote. So, for example, regardless of how you feel about abortion and election denial, the fact of the matter is the midterm result was quite extraordinary. You know, whether you like it or not, the American people actually moderated the move by voting and indicating it did not like the radicalism of those steps. Now you can definitely understand that if we have a replay of the 2020 election, we'll see who wins. And at that point, you should be able to get a view. I don't see, for example, the Democrats ever going back to the immigration policies that it had when it reacted to Trump and Trump immigration policies. So I do believe the elections are going to resolve this, Matt.
So will the 24 election be will whoever wins then be able to say the American public voted and here's what we're going to do because this is what I said we're going to do? Or
well, it seems to me that that will be the challenge of leadership. Whoever wins, you know, whoever wins. But you know, if in fact we come out of that. Migration may be the last issue that can be dealt with through a bipartisan way, except this window that we may have in the next leading up. Even though I generally agree with you that leading up to the election is not a good time to make big changes, let's see just how challenging the next 30 days are, and what it brings out or doesn't bring out in our political leadership.
The UN Refugee Agency indicates there's now more than 100 million people that they categorize as refugees. And I wonder why isn't this more of an international crisis as opposed to just our border crisis? Why isn't it viewed as something that needs to be done on an international scale? So
global, it's definitely the kind of mobility that we're seeing is a global issue. And UNHCR is right, but this is the dilemma. We live in a system in which nation states dominate in the so-called Westphalian system. And yet these issues are not, they are borderless issues that no one nation can deal with. So we're struggling to get Mexico and Central America, and Costa Rica and Panama, Colombia to cooperate, let alone to go and understand how we should be cooperating with the EU or countries in Africa. But you're exactly right. This is a global issue, a borderless issue, in a system in which multilateral organizations like UNHCR have not been given the resources that it needs to do it, nor do nation states cede sovereignty and sovereign power to these agencies to be able to accomplish the kind of effective response to a borderless issue, an issue that is beyond nation states, but nation states will not give the UN or Interpol or the International Migration Organization the power or the capacity that it would need to dent the problem. It's one of the larger challenges, political challenges that dominate the international situation today.
But would more, I mean, I just by pure coincidence toured a Kenyan refugee camp this morning on Google Street View, just kind of was tooling around. And it seems like a deplorable, horrible place, and it's been there since 1992. Isn't getting any better. It's got 600,000 people in it. So I'm not advocating that that's a solution, but it seems to be something we don't do much of in this hemisphere.
And that's good that we don't have camps that like Palestinian camps or various African camps, or the ones that came out of the conflict zones in the Middle East and now have large refugee camps in places like Turkey. That's not a satisfactory solution. But the fact of the matter is we don't even have the ability to convene the kind of transnational discussions that would even begin to start to talk about how do you manage the flows in ways that are secure and humanitarian. And as opposed to that, we turn it over to the underworld of globalization, the smuggling and human trafficking organizations, and they're the ones that control the dynamic. So that's not satisfactory. So there is some space for international cooperation between the creation of refugee camps and the withdrawal from the arena, such that smugglers dominated entirely.
I was intrigued by your role with Altana Trade. Carnegie Mellon has research that shows that artificial intelligence could be used to handle an immense amount of white-collar chores. Why couldn't we have an artificial intelligence program that evaluates on a cursory level asylum claims? It could do 100,000 an hour, and that would have preliminary baseline findings of facts and stuff like that. It just seems to me like this is one area where AI could help when you have a massive backlog.
Now, so it's interesting. So the Altana, the startup that's now 150 people, is limited to supply chain visibility. That is cargo and goods rather than people. But there's no question that AI, for all the threats and risks that it presents, also offers great possibilities along the lines you suggest. But when it comes to legal issues, see, this is interesting. So, the law firms are now dealing with having to confront the fact that associates are doing legal assignments by way of ChatGPT. So you have to be careful until we get some ground rules in place before you do it. But there's no question you could get preliminary determinations done. But I don't see that happening in the short term, and probably shouldn't until we have these guardrails and guidelines in place, because it's still not clear just whether or not HAL from 2001 will provide judgment in addition to efficiency to the process. But I take your point.
Alan, I also am always concerned when something of this magnitude is about to happen. A lot of media, mainstream media and otherwise, will all flock to the border in different cities, and these images will be shown to the American public, and they never get to see the other sides of border life or other beautiful parts of Mexico and wonderful things that happen. You, as someone who has seen a lot of Mexico on both sides, both politically and just lifestyle, what can what light can you shed on what else is happening in terms of border life? What the American people should maybe pay more attention to?
Well, it remains el tercer país. Look at the story about Tijuana and San Diego that was told in the book that was published last year, two countries, two cities, one community. You know, that vibrance, that dynamism, that bicultural, binational reality that we know on the border is not generally known. There's no question that that's a problem. But you know, as is being celebrated this year in the World Design Center Award that Tijuana and San Diego received jointly, that word will get out. But Laura, there's no question that you know, the good news stories are hard to get attention to. That's just the nature of the beast, both from the media side, but also from the human receptor side. But border communities will continue to thrive, and we always survive these crises that periodically afflict us, whether it's migration crises or financial crises, or even occasionally weather events and pandemics like the H1N1. But you know, the vibrance of cross-border life and communities is a genuine source of optimism for me.
Let me ask you, we're kind of at time, and there's a question I want to ask, because I think this will help not only us understand this better from your perspective, but also the public understand. So everyone expects the next day to be insane, and maybe the next 2 days, but you said maybe we'll wait 30 days to. So at what point, when on the calendar do we say this is expected chaos, and when does it turn into a problem where the government is in over its head and it is a major problem that's just, it's not going to get fixed right away?
So if you look at the question is the numbers. So let's assume that there are 100 worst case, there are 150,000 people here, and they're going to be entering, presenting themselves at 10,000 or 12,000 a day. That's 10 days. So the real question, Matt, is not, you know, you can handle that. You'll have to meter people into the country because we don't have the holding capacity. But the real question, and it's unfortunate, if we don't fill the vacuum with policy and resources to respond, then in fact, the only limiting factor is the capacity of the smuggling organization to get people from the sending country to the border. And that one, in fact, there is a limit on how many people could be handled by this smuggling infrastructure. But because we have not effectively countered these organizations that increasingly involve transnational crime and are including the drug cartels that control the plazas leading up to the U.S. border, that capacity keeps growing. I mean, we've never been faced with a situation where you have 100,000, 150,000 people poised as they are to attempt to enter the country. So that's the challenge. We've got to fill the vacuum with policies and backed up by resources and capacity that implement it and actually create a genuine deterrent. We need to really take on the trafficking organizations and smuggling organizations that every time the government gets into one of these things, they say we're going to attack the smuggling organizations, and somehow we never do effectively. That means using the whole of government power, intelligence, prosecution, national security, to really dismantle these smuggling organizations so that they can't keep their conveyor belts of migrants moving. We are going to see within 10 days whether or not any of that happens. And if not, just how many more people the smuggling infrastructure can propel toward the border.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that insight. Anyone else with a question? Well, we got Alan here. Anything you want to add, Alan, we covered a ton of ground, and obviously, a lot of eyeballs are going to be on the border for the next.
Yeah, so let me go back to where I started. This is basically we're fighting the last war. We've got a series, whether it's global mobility, broken asylum laws, smuggling, the centrality of smuggling organizations. We basically have to recreate a system of border control. It's not counterterrorism, although that has to be kept in mind. It's migration management. And that starts with a reform of the immigration laws, starting with the asylum law. But the border security issue that we faced on September 11, 2001, we should take pride in the fact that we had a political system and a series of public servants, men and women at the state, local, and federal levels who actually built a border security system that worked and succeeded. Knock on wood, we never had another terrorist event through the border or an attack on our cities through the border by Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other jihadist organization. But that system has been overtaken by events, and we have to have the same consensus that generated that system build the new system, starting with reform of the laws. Our challenge is border control, and the challenge of border control today is migration management. That's what we have to do in the mid and long term to get a handle on this.
Yeah. I appreciate you coming in. Thank you so much. When are you coming back to San Diego? Do you know?
Well, I'm, with the pandemic over, and with Lisa and I have family here, so we hope to be here 4 or 5 times during the year, rather than remote visits.
Yeah.
But thank you for the opportunity, and I thank everyone at the UT for keeping a vibrant local paper going.
Labor of love, my friend. All right. See ya. Take care.
See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.